Rob Hall, a skilled mountaineer from New Zealand, had climbed Mount Everest 5 times, but in May 1996, his final ascent turned into a nightmare. He died in a brutal blizzard, stranded for over 20 hours in Everest's dead zone, where survival is nearly impossible. This is his tragic story. Born in Christchurch, New Zealand, in January 1961, Rob was the youngest of 9 children in a struggling family. From a young age, he showed independence and determination, traits that would define his life. Rob was drawn to adventure. Living near the Southern Alps fueled his passion for mountaineering. He left school early and found work designing outdoor gear. In 1980, Rob first ventured into the deadly Himalayas, climbing Amadablam in Nepal. It was just the beginning. In 1981, he made his name with a daring winter ascent of Mount Cook's Caroline Face, one of New Zealand's toughest climbs. For the next few years, Rob split his time between working in gear manufacturing and guiding expeditions. He partnered with fellow climber Gary Ball, and together, they attempted to conquer Annapurna, K2, and Everest. After several failed attempts, they finally reached the summit of Everest in 1990. Leading a team that included Peter Hillary, the son of Everest legend Edmund Hillary, they celebrated at the top, with the news broadcasted back to New Zealand. Fueled by this success, Rob and Gary set out to climb the 7 highest peaks on every continent in record time. Over 7 grueling months, they conquered Everest, Denali, Kilimanjaro, Elbrus, Aconcagua, Kosciuszko, and Vinson Massif. They completed the 7 Summits Challenge and became heroes back home. But the mountains were calling them back for more. In 1991, Rob and Gary founded Adventure Consultants, a guiding business for clients wanting to tackle the world's deadliest mountains. Their company quickly gained a reputation for success, particularly on Everest, where they led many climbers to the summit. In 1992, Rob, Gary, and a new teammate, Guy Cotter, led a successful expedition to Everest. But their partnership faced a devastating blow in 1993. Gary, Rob's longtime friend and climbing partner, died of pulmonary edema while attempting Dhaulagiri. The loss crushed Rob, and he started using supplemental oxygen on future expeditions to prevent such tragedies. But the mountains wouldn't give him peace. Despite his grief, Rob pushed forward. He continued leading successful expeditions, including another triumphant Everest climb in 1994. That year, he also tackled K2, the world's most dangerous peak, finally reaching its summit on his 4th attempt. The mountain had almost taken his life, but Rob emerged victorious. In 1995, Rob Cotter and Ed Viesters prepared for another Everest expedition, but heavy snowfalls delayed them, and fate would soon show its darkest side. Rob Hall knew the danger was growing, yet he forced the team to turn back. Only one climber, Lob Singh Jungle, managed to reach the south summit. The others, including Rob, had to retreat because of thick snow and the ticking clock. No matter how hard his clients begged, Rob refused to continue. It was already too late to climb safely. He couldn't ignore the pleas of a French climber, Chantal Modi, who was suffering from a life-threatening condition, cerebral edema. Even though she wasn't his responsibility, he felt he had to help. But that year would hold much darker events for Rob. Later that year, Rob, along with investors, set his sights on Makalu, the 5th highest mountain in the world. Driven by ambition, he used resources from his commercial expeditions to make the climb. In just 14 months, he stood on the summits of 5 of the world's tallest peaks. His final success was Makalu in October 1995. Afterward, he wrote with chilling reflection, "Fortune had smiled on me. I gazed across to Everest. We had stood on the south summit just 11 days before. What a fantastic planet, and how lucky I am to walk its mountains." In 1996, Rob was back at Everest, but with a new group. His trusted partners weren't available, so he teamed up with Australian Mike Groom and New Zealand guide Andy Harris. This time, 8 clients joined them. The climbers, Doug Hansen, John Krakauer, Beck Weathers, and others, were desperate to reach the summit, but none of them were prepared for what was coming. Months earlier, Rob's wife, Jan Arnold, had to back out of the climb when she learned she was pregnant. She had summited Everest with him in 1993, but this time Rob had to face the mountain without her. The expedition began without any issues until May 10th. On that day, Rob's team, along with 3 other groups, left from Camp 4 at midnight. Scott Fisher's Mountain Madness team was there, along with climbers from Taiwan and India. The problem? Too many climbers, all trying to reach the top at once. Delays began to pile up, and when they reached the Hillary Step, the final challenge, no fixed ropes were in place. The climbers had to wait, wasting precious time. By 2 p.m., many hadn't even reached the summit, but they should have already been descending. Rob's Sirdar, Ang Dorje, and the Sherpas who had reached the summit were forced to start down by 3 p.m. But disaster was already looming. Doug Hansen refused to turn back. 1 year earlier, Rob had turned him around at the South Summit, but Doug returned this year determined to make it. He told Krakauer that Rob had urged him to try again, pushing him to give Everest one last shot. But some whispered that this might have been why Rob broke his own rule. He let Doug continue to the top, even though time was slipping away. At around 4 p.m., Doug finally reached the summit, but it was far too late. Exhausted and low on oxygen, he could barely move. Scott Fisher reached the summit around 3:40 p.m., with Sherpas waiting, but the wind was picking up and dark clouds were closing in. Rob stayed behind, waiting for Doug to arrive. When Doug did, Rob rushed to help him the final steps to the top. They spent only minutes at the summit before starting the perilous descent. But Doug was too weak. 100 meters down, Doug ran out of oxygen. Rob tried to save him, even as the storm gathered strength. Rob sent the Sherpas ahead to help the others, knowing the risk, but refusing to leave Doug behind. Doug had pushed himself to the absolute limit, using every ounce of energy to reach the top. Now, he had nothing left. By 4:30 p.m., Rob radioed in. He and Doug were in trouble. The storm was coming fast, and they were trapped high on the summit ridge, stranded in the death zone, far from safety. The wind howled, snow blinding them, and they had no oxygen left. As Rob tried to bring Doug down, the mountain unleashed its fury. At 5 p.m., the blizzard hit with terrifying force, burying the trail and plunging everything into darkness. Rob radioed for help, but they were lost in the storm, stranded with no way out. The mountain had claimed them. Hansen had fallen unconscious, but he was still alive at 5:30 p.m. Harris, desperate to help, began climbing to the Hillary Step with water and oxygen. Meanwhile, Guy Cotter, a climbing partner of both Hall and Harris, was guiding another expedition just a few miles away from Everest. He had been listening to Hall's radio all day and became deeply worried by 4:53 p.m. Cotter urgently radioed Hall, begging him to descend to the South Summit to get oxygen. Cotter knew Hall couldn't save Doug without it. Hall replied, saying he could make it down alone, but not with Doug. An hour passed, and Hall was still with Hansen at the Hillary Step, trapped. Cotter again pleaded with him to leave Doug behind and save himself, but Hall refused. He wouldn't abandon his client. As the storm raged on, Hall tried everything but couldn't get Doug down the steep Hillary Step. Reluctantly, he finally descended alone to the South Summit. But by then, Doug Hansen and Andy Harris, who had risked his life to try to rescue them, had vanished. No one knows for sure what happened to Doug that night, but many believe he lost his footing in the brutal conditions. As Rob tried to guide him, Doug is thought to have fallen over 7,000 feet to his death. His ice axe was later found stuck in the ridge, a chilling reminder of where he likely slipped. Doug Hansen had achieved his dream of reaching the top of Everest, but it cost him his life. On May 11th, at 4:43 a.m., nearly 12 hours after the storm had struck, Hall radioed down, saying he was on the South Summit. His oxygen was gone, frozen by ice, and his hands and feet were numb, making it almost impossible to move. By 9 a.m., he managed to fix his oxygen mask, but the cold had already taken a terrible toll. In a heartbreaking final call, Hall radioed base camp and asked them to connect him to his wife, Jan Arnold. With his last bit of strength, he told her, "Sleep well, my sweetheart. Please don't worry too much." Hall died shortly after from exposure. 12 days later, climbers from the IMAX expedition found Rob Hall's body, half buried in snow, lying on his side in a shallow ice hollow. He had frozen to death. 8 climbers died in that deadly storm: Rob Hall, Andy Harris, Doug Hansen, Yasuko Namba, Scott Fisher, and Sewang Samanla. Hall never returned. Despite all his expertise, he ignored his own turnaround time, staying far too long to help Doug Hansen. That loyalty trapped them both in the death zone, with no escape. In 1997, a year after Hall's death, a Polish climber was stranded on the Tibetan side of Everest after an avalanche. Rob Hall had once driven across the Himalayas into Tibet to save this man, showing the world his dedication and bravery. But this time, Rob Hall wasn't there to help. New Zealand had lost one of its greatest climbers and expedition leaders. Hall's skills went far beyond just climbing. He was awarded by the US Navy for rescue missions in Antarctica and praised by the Himalayan Rescue Association for saving climbers in the Himalayas. 2 months after Rob Hall died, his wife Jan gave birth to their daughter, Sarah Arnold Hall. Jan remarried in 2002, but she and Sarah still carry the memory of Rob Hall. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and a comment below. For more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.